Which side do you have more space on? You want me to say hi to everybody?
No.
Then I'm gonna get out of here.
Yeah, you can. Yeah. All right, we are live, and
Welcome.
coming here from Seattle in our living room, and
And I am at the winery in Walla Walla.
yeah. So I want to say thank you to everyone who has tuned in. Not sure I know how many people are in, but thank you. Definitely, the first thing we've noticed is people are drinking a heck of a lot of wine. I have seen more reviews on Cellar Tracker and stuff like that on our wine and Instagram, and it's absolutely crazy. So we figured we would do this live to have people drink even more, because it's 4:30 here and 7:30 on the East Coast. So why not? We'll drink a little more wine. I think we're all going to be so sick of Zoom in a month that we're never going to use it again. But if this works, we'll keep doing it. You might have seen some of our videos on Instagram at Gramercy Cellars, or I have another channel for wines that we're putting up international, which is Greg HMS Wine on Instagram. And we're going to try to put more here in on YouTube and things like that. So what we're kind of doing is talking about the spring release wines. And if you're making comments, we can see the comments, which is absolutely fantastic. If you have questions, we'll try to answer questions. I'm trying to be producer, director, actor, and the entire thing at one time. And as I was saying to Brandon before, it's like I'm more nervous sitting here in my living room talking to a camera than I am when I teach 800 kids at Cornell about wine. So it's been it's definitely interesting. So why don't we start talking about rosé? So Brandon, why don't you tell us where rosé comes from, and I'll talk about kind of why we did it and what our real idea behind it was.
Yeah, so our rosé is all from Olson Vineyard. Olson's kind of a Rhone powerhouse in the state. It's just as the crow flies from Red Mountain. It's about 3 miles across the ridgeline, but it's a completely different weather pattern than Red Mountain, so it's much cooler than Red Mountain is. But we started working with Cinsault out there at Olson, and we were making it for red wine and really enjoying it, but knew that Cinsault was the base for kind of your classic Provence blend, and that kind of is what inspired us to start making the rosé from Olson.
Yeah, and when let's kind of talk about what rosé is, because for me, I think rosé can be a couple of different things, but our definition of it, for me, it's really, I want to farm for rosé. Historically, I don't really think people woke up and said, hey, let's make pink wine. It might have happened in a couple of places, but really the reason people were making pink wine was they had red wine and they were in a cold place, like making wine in the mountains of France or the mountains of Italy, and they noticed that if they took out a little bit of the pink juice early in a ferment, they would actually get more intense, more concentrated, more flavorful red wine. And when we weren't doing really serious, or they weren't doing really serious management in their vineyards, where they were cutting down yields and getting the canopy balanced with the fruit zone, you would have big issues with tannins. So the more intensity you could get with fruit flavors, the better that was to balance out the tannin. So if you're taking out some of the juice a day or two into the ferment, you're going to end up with pink juice. So that's called the saignée method. People basically started drinking that wine over the summer, and people realized, wow, this is really refreshing. So let's basically keep doing that. But I think that a lot of what rosé has become today is where people say, I'm just going to take any sort of red. So I'm going to take my Grenache, and I haven't really farmed for rosé, and I'm just going to make a rosé out of it. So I'm just going to stick the racking wand in the tank, suck out some pink juice, and it's going to make a wine. And for me, it can make absolutely delicious wine at times. But for me, what rosé is, it's really the structure of white wine with the flavor and intensity of red. So if you're just farming for red grapes, you're probably going to be missing a little acid. You're probably going to have a little too high alcohol, and the refreshment yum factor may go way down. So for me, I think that choosing to start in the vineyard and actually farming for rosé kind of is the way you want to be. Did you agree, Brandon? I mean, that's the way we do it. So I guess you agree to a point.
I agree 100%, and I also agree that it's very important to crop it for rosé in the vineyard, but also to harvest at the same time so that we can get the grapes homogeneous together. We've realized over time it's taken actually quite a few years to figure out what kind of tonnage we need in the Cinsault and what kind of tonnage we need in the Syrah to get everything to balance out and ripen at the same time. But we finally, pretty much starting in about 16, we've got them to ripen at around the same time, so we can bring everything together and let them ferment together as a whole, which we feel has greatly improved the quality of the rosé for us.
Yeah, when we first started doing rosé, we would, if you look at rosé from the way the grapes ripen from a truly scientific, technical perspective, in Olson Vineyard, which is kind of in the center of the state. Let's see if I can actually show you a picture of where Olson is. If you look at if you can kind of see where Red Mountain is on our little map here, that's where Olson is. It's not on Red Mountain, but it's very, very close to Red Mountain. And Syrah will always ripen first over there. So what we would do is we would pick the Syrah, we would make wine, stay up all night trying to get the right color. And then 2 weeks later, go harvest the Grenache and the Cinsault. And then we would basically get the color on that. And then we would have to try to match up both colors. And obviously we're not visual artists, as you can see. So it was always really hard to get the color right. But it was kind of cool when we figured out that if you harvest everything at one time, technically you have overripe Syrah but underripe Grenache, that the whole thing actually balances out. And I think personally that the wine comes together much quicker than it did.
Very much so. It's just blending those in tank together, getting that right color right off the press, not having multiple pressings where you're introducing oxygen into the wine. It just overall is better when we can harvest everything at one time. And I think that, the rosé has been a learning process over time, and every year we've gotten better and better, including this 19, which I feel like is by far the best one we've ever made yet.
Yeah, it's pretty rocking. And the kind of a funny story about the rosé was, we never really just look at alcohol and say we want to make a wine that's X alcohol. But if you look at the classic wines from Provence and France and from Bandol, which is not made from Cinsault, Syrah, and Grenache, but is more Mourvedre based, you're really looking 12.7 alcohol, 13 alcohol. And we kept calculating numbers and being like, this should be exactly 13% alcohol. And then it would come out 13.3, 13.5. And we were like, why? Why is this going on? Why can't we get the exact alcohol we're looking for? And then we were having a conversation with someone who was in France, and he was like, oh, that's because rosé converts at a different amount. You're going to get more alcohol. And we're like, really? So just a random conversation. Just a random conversation is helped us kind of make better wine.
Yeah, the alcohol on this rosé comes in right at 13, and that's where we feel like this wine really shines, is right at 13% alcohol.
Yeah. So Sean Horrigan, he's saying, interesting that we matched the color first. I've never expected that. Obviously we're not just looking for color. We're looking for intensity, complexity, everything like that. But the one thing with rosé is if you go too far and the rosé starts to turn pink, you can't really get it back to orange. So you kind of have to make a decision that, are you going to do an orange style salmon rosé, or are you going to do a light pink rosé? Because if you go too far, you can't get the color right. And unfortunately, the color doesn't go consistently. You can't, you might get no color for 2 hours and then get a ton of color over the next 15 minutes. So it's always a balancing game to try to get the colors right.
Well, the other tricky thing about getting the color right is the use of sulfur and how that works with pressing. The second you add any sulfur to the wine, that takes out the color in the wine. So a lot of times it's really hard to tell where you're at in terms of color because you have a little bit of sulfur in the wine that's basically bleaching the color out until that goes away.
Yeah, and whenever we talk about wine, I always like talking about the other stuff that I like. For me, Provence or our wine is kind of modeled after Chateau Parasol in Provence. I think they make absolutely amazing rosé. Pretty much anything from Bandol is going to be fantastic. Chateau Pibernon makes amazing rosé, but if you're looking for other things for rosé, I would say look to Provence to do a little research on the better producers, particularly Parasol. And also look to Bandol, and in Bandol, it's pretty hard to go wrong with rosé there. So I'm about to start to drink some red.
Yeah.
What's next?
We have the 2017 Third Man.
Perfect. I don't want to dump this. I kind of want to drink it.
I had to dump mine.
Hey, Pam, people are asking for a cameo, so you're going to have to come over here. Say hi.
Hello, world.
Get on camera.
I am on camera.
No, you're behind Brandon.
Oh, hello, world.
There you go.
Hope you're all having fun. Hope you're all drinking a lot.
How do we spell parasol? Peyressol is how you spell parasol. So, Third Man. When I tell the story of the winery, a lot of people may think that we didn't really plan anything out. We just decided to make Syrah, and then everything else was an accident. But with Grenache, I don't think Brandon and I ever really woke up and said, "Hey, let's make Grenache." We had Tempranillo in our estate vineyard in Walla Walla, which we're going to taste a little later. And I was like, I don't know about Washington Tempranillo. I don't know what that's going to be like. So I said, if we're going to make Tempranillo, we probably need to blend it with a little bit of Grenache. That's typical in Spain. Garnacha with Tempranillo, they kind of balance each other out. So asked around and found Olsen Vineyard. And everyone says that the rosé there is absolutely fantastic. And we blended it together, and it was just awful. The Tempranillo and the Grenache did not play nice. But we were like, wow, the Grenache is really good. What if we make a Grenache wine? And kind of started from there and found used different Syrah sources and found Mourvedre. And I think, I don't know, what do you I say all the time that 2010 was a vintage where Syrah really turned the corner. 2012 was a vintage where Cab kind of went to another level. What do you think? When do you think Grenache really kind of took a step up for us?
I really think probably right around 2014 is when we really started to kind of take hold of the Grenache and really figure out what we were doing. I think we got our sourcing right then. Originally we were playing with 3 different sources of Grenache. We were having a hard time kind of fitting those together. In 14, I feel like we dialed back our amount of sources we were using and really figured out how much whole cluster and how to do the whole cluster in Grenache. And that's the other tricky thing with Grenache and whole cluster is it's about the hardest thing ever to foot stomp. And so getting those clusters to actually be stomped in your ferment was really tricky. I think we had a lot of carbonic maceration happening. I feel like now we've really, starting in 14, I feel like we got it dialed in and we've just been getting better ever since.
Yeah. So those who've never been to the winery or been been out to winery and harvest, foot stomping. If you're my age, you might remember, or older, you might remember the Lucy video where they foot stomped a bunch of grapes. The I Love Lucy show. no one under my age knows what that is, so I don't use that example anymore. But the funny thing about foot stomping is you actually have to get in there and stomp the grapes with your feet. There's really no other way to crush it. And every year, the harvest interns come in. They're like, "Oh, we do a lot of whole cluster. I can't wait to get in the grapes." And they don't realize by the middle of September, it's going to be 40 degrees out in the morning in Walla Walla. And we always try to be the first pick in the morning if we can for Syrah and Grenache. So the grapes come in, we start fermenting, we start processing the grapes, and then you have the experience the first time you put your feet in 45-degree grapes. It's probably not the most fun thing that that you do. And later on, people start arguing on, no, you were 5 minutes late. You're foot stomping today. But I think it's a technique that is super important. But and there's really no other way to do it.
Yeah, you can't be as gentle in any other way other than your feet. Even as far as putting boots on, we won't even allow anyone to put boots on, because the second you put boots on, you start grinding stems and start leaching out compounds you don't want out of those stems.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm kind of putting you on the spot, Brandon. But if you would say, all around the world, people know GSM. And what would you say? I have my opinion, but what would you say on what each grape variety contributes to the blend?
Okay. Yeah. So Grenache, I would say, provides this kind of lightness and airiness, and it's almost like Grenache is sort of the rest of the world's Pinot Noir. It's light, it's red fruit driven, it's easy to drink. To me, a lot of times I pick up Grenache, and as long as it's not that super heavy 16% alcohol Grenache, I almost think of it as the summer red. It just has that real nice, approachable structure to it. Tannins are usually pretty mellow, acid's not over the top, and so it's a nice, approachable wine. The Syrah aspect of it is really what we use it for. I feel is adding to the mid palate texture. Syrah tends to hit you big on the mid palate. The tannins tend to be pretty mellow as well, but it really fills out the kind of middle of the wine. And then the Mourvedre is sort of that kind of meaty core. It really adds sort of the kind of roasted meat, and that's all Mourvedre makes you think about is roasted meat and like strawberries, and so get those all three together, and that's really what they meld well together and create a beautiful balance. So.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And, sometimes there's words in wine that people are like, I have no idea what that means. And Brandon says, mid-palate flavor. Obviously, I know what he's talking about. But one of the things you can with wine is when you taste wine, some varieties you taste all the flavor in the front of your mouth, and some varieties you taste all the flavor in the back of your mouth. And a real easy way to do that is get a bottle that's 100% Cabernet, get another bottle that's 100% Merlot. If you taste them, you'll see you actually taste the flavors in different parts of your mouth. So you taste all of the Cabernet flavor in the front and all of the Merlot flavor in the back. That's one of the reasons you put them together, because we actually have different flavor recognitions on our palate, and the grape will taste in a different spot, and it'll make a more complete wine. When we're blending, the hardest thing for us to blend is the middle of the wine. It's really easy to make a wine where there's a lot of flavor on the front and a lot of flavor in the back. But if you look at the greatest wines of the world, to me, most of the flavor is right in the middle. And that's pretty much what I think is what a great wine is. And we blend, we're always like, okay, we got the mid palate right. And, going back to, for me, like, when did Grenache kind of go to another level? There's this flavor in the Southern Rhone. We're not the Southern Rhone. We never will be. Washington's always going to be different, and California's always going to be different. But I like to use comparisons of I get this flavor in the Southern Rhone, and that's kind of our model. But the great Chateauneuf, Gigondas, Vaccaras of the world, they have this like Luden's cough drop, the red Luden's cough drop flavor to it. And for years, I was like, wow, I really like Grenache, but it doesn't have the red Ludens cough drop. And for me, it was like somewhere between 14 and 16, where I was like, oh, all of a sudden we have that cough drop flavor, and it's a flavor I remember my dad used to always have them in his car, and so it's a flavor that just resonates with me, and I kind of find it in our in the wine, and particularly in the 2017.
Yeah, I think the hardest thing we had with Grenache is that you have to pick Grenache a little bit riper than what we're normally used to. And I think early on in the days of Grenache, we were trying to pick up based on how we were picking Syrah, and you just can't do that in Grenache. You have to let Grenache hang on the vine a little bit longer to get some more flavor development. So I think that's kind of what we learned, and what we've been learning over time, is that Grenache just needs to hang a little bit longer, and it needs to get just a little bit riper, and we can dial back alcohol with the Syrah and the Mourvedre component of it.
Yeah, yeah, it's one of the things in with wine is as even as a sommelier when I was studying wine, you would think that we're going to make something in Bordeaux, we're going to make something in Chateauneuf de Pop, places where, if I had an editor, we'd have to edit that out, but obviously, um, but the, um, places where you blend, you don't always say, hey, this variety we're going to pick at the peak of its ripeness. This variety we're going to pick at the peak of its ripeness. And this one we're going to pick at the peak. You might have to say, hey, we're going to pick this one a little late. We're going to pick this one a little early, and then blend everything together to make a complete wine. And it's actually very funny sometimes because people will notice that we pick a vineyard and they'll go pick the day after or a couple of days after. And I was like, ooh, we picked that Syrah really early because we wanted it as a blending component, not because it was actually ripe or something. So it's always interesting to see how these wines definitely, how they blend together. There was a question about how we actually foot stomp. Do we wear plastic booties? The answer is no. We basically just clean our feet, and we have an ozone machine. You clean your feet with ozone. And, wine is one of these amazing things where there's a lot of bacteria that can taste bad, but there's not a lot of stuff that can actually harm us as humans. So as long as we're clean as possible in every part of the winemaking process, and you just basically do what they've been doing for thousands of years and get in there and squish it with your feet.
Yep, we just make sure and sanitize because we're using all native fermentation. So we just want to make sure and be as clean as possible going in there. But yeah, you can only be so extreme with cleaning someone. We're not going to put like acid chemicals on on their legs or anything like that. We're just keep it clean and foot stomp well. That's I think one of the more important things is that you get every fermentation foot stomp well, or else you'll have a bunch of carbonic maceration happening in your fermentation, which is basically when the berries ferment intracellularly inside the actual berry, and you'll get a very fruity wine when you have carbonic maceration. So we try to avoid that.
Yeah, and what that basically means is your wine's going to start to taste like pink cotton candy, and
exactly.
Yeah, and we just don't want to make pink cotton candy wine. Although there are places where it really works. In Beaujolais, it works amazingly. If you saw the video I did yesterday about, it seems like 20 years ago that I did that video. It was only 24 hours ago. Beaujolais and carbonic maceration work really, really, really well together, and even there's even some parts with Grenache where it works really well, and where it can actually work with Syrah, but I think you kind of have to pick your place and understand what it's doing with your wine. So here's an interesting question. Do you believe Washington has a defining grape variety that we grow best?
Whew. That's a tough question for our state. I mean, if I had to go to my heart, I would say Syrah, but Cabernet is probably always king in our state, I would say. But I don't. What do you think?
I think if I could make a case for Mourvedre, but there's a Mourvedre. There's a caveat on that because I think the places where Mourvedre grows to a world-class level is really small. Where the places where Cabernet grows to a world-class level is a lot larger. Because like the Horse Seven Hills is an amazing place for Cabernet. And I saw someone asking me about Horse Seven Hills and Finney, and we'll definitely talk about that as we get down to the Cabernet. Um, and the basalt hills of Walla Walla for Syrah, and and the rocks, they're unique places for each variety. But yeah, I don't know if I could put a hand on one variety where, because the state's big, and
Exactly.
I think it's a tough question, but
It's big and it's diverse. We have so many different kind of landscapes across the state, that it's really hard to say one thing is our grape. You just can't.
yeah. So let's move on to Syrah. So this is a interesting wine for me. Well, it's not interesting wine; it's a great wine for me. And the reason being is this was basically the Syrah that got Pam and I to Washington State. We were with Norm McKibben at Amavi/Pepperbridge. We were tasting Lake Collines Syrah, and I went, "Wow, if I was going to make wine, I'd want to make that." And Norm was like, "We'll sell you fruit." I'm like, "I know how to make wine." He goes, "Come work harvest," and we basically went and worked harvest, then came back and said, "Hey, we want to make Syrah and wine in Washington State." So this is a vineyard we've literally worked with since day one. And if you've been to Walla Walla, if you're looking at the mountains on the east side of the state or the east side of the valley, this is basically right at the base of the valley. So it's a really cool site. Brandon, if you're gonna pick like the perfect altitude in Walla Walla for Syrah, what would you pick?
I mean, I would say like 1,300 feet, maybe 1,250.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. If you talk to the classic producers in the Rhone, everyone says Syrah needs a view. Obviously, traditionally most grape varieties were like that because you planted grapes in places where you couldn't farm traditionally, where you couldn't do vegetables, where you couldn't do fruit trees, where you couldn't do any sort of animals. So traditionally, all the grapes were where nothing else would grow. But Syrah in particular is really a grape that likes a hillside, and I think it's because it needs shade, and I also think it needs a windy site. But for me, if you want to make Syrah that's smoked meat, black pepper, you really need a shady, windy site to get that happen.
Yeah. Syrah also likes to put out a lot of vigor when it has everything it needs. So it likes to grow a lot. If a prime example is our Forgotten Hills vineyard, which is a little farther down the valley floor, it tends to it hasn't been watered in 4 years and it grows like crazy every single year. So when you put it up on the hillsides a little bit, it tends to slow down the amount of vigor that it's going to have up there.
Yeah, for sure. But this wine is it's funny. We've done so many vintages now, Brandon and I, and you sell. I might go to Chicago or New York and sell different vintages of different wines, and I kind of forget what was in each wine as time goes on, and I was looking at this. And I'm like, wow, we actually put Block 46 into this wine. So traditionally, Lake Collines is kind of a gentle slope and then a steeper slope as you look at the vineyard. And the steeper slope is there's good Syrah throughout the entire hill, but Brandon and I really like the steeper slope. And traditionally, Block 46, which is exactly right in the middle, that's where we really like that Syrah. And it usually goes into John Lewis, which is our reserve wine. But for some reason, we put the 46 into this wine. What was the 17 John Lewis what was the blend on that one?
17 John Lewis has Forgotten Hills in it. It has, I think, a little bit of Block 46 as well as a little bit of Block 36, which is just down the hill from that. So whereas traditionally John Lewis has been mostly based on Block 46, in the 17 vintage, it was kind of more of a collaboration between several of our kind of east side of Walla Walla Syrah vineyards. So that was the main difference in 17 is we just made a better blend, including some Forgotten Hills and our other block of Lake Collines out there.
Yeah. Are you still there? Cool.
Yeah, I'm here.
Yeah, I personally like 17 as a vintage for Syrah. You know, all the time I get the question, you know, when should you drink the wines? And when I write the newsletter, I always send the newsletter to Nicole and Robbie, and they always respond back, when is this wine going to be ready to drink? And you know, I put a number down there. I might say 2021 and 2025. Reality is, I don't know. You know, I think one of the great things about wine is no one really knows when a wine is ready to drink. But as I've been thinking about Syrah since, you know, we've started making it in 2005 and having had a lot of Syrah before that, I think a great kind of guide to when to drink Syrah is 6 years after the vintage. So, you know, this year, I think the 14s and 15s are really starting to open up and just be great wines. And I find that in Australia, I find that on the Rhone, I find that in the Sonoma Coast. That 6 years is kind of when I want to start drinking Syrah.
Yeah, I agree. And you know, that's the nice thing about Syrah is the tannins are usually not overly aggressive like Cabernet, and so usually you're just waiting on that aromatic development. You're not necessarily waiting on those very aggressive tannins to mellow out because usually the wine's pretty approachable early on in terms of structure.
Yeah, exactly. But I think, you know, Syrah is a variety where, you know, when we talk about wine, we say, you know, primary flavors and tertiary flavors. It's the geeky words for stuff that tastes like fruit and stuff that develops later. And you know, Syrah is always red berries and things like blueberries, and those secondary flavors like black olive and smoked meat and pepper. Those can take a little while to develop, particularly in Washington. I find that it takes maybe a year or two for that to develop. Where in the Rhone, it can be straight on. You get that black pepper and smoked meat. And I think that while I like Syrah young, it's a variety that I actually like to age. And traditionally, I'm not the kind of person where I'm like, oh, I want these wines to age for 20 years before I drink them. I kind of prefer wine when it's in its teenage years versus when it's in an elderly stage, personally.
Yeah, I agree. I really love when a Syrah ages long enough that you get some of that soy sauce component, which I feel like is you don't get that much earlier than like 10, 12 years. But when you can smell the soy sauce, like that's when Syrah gets really interesting.
Yeah. So there's a question about co-fermenting. So why would you ever co-ferment? So this was a technique where you basically take you have red wine fermenting and the wine, for whatever reason, is not where you want it to be. So traditionally, if I was a farmer in Italy or France and I'm not at a famous estate and I'm just making wine for the family and for the village, I might have 13 different varieties in my in my winery. It's called a field blend. You just might blend everything together. And what they noticed over the years was, particularly with white varieties, that if you ferment the white varieties with the red, it gives you aromatics, but it also gives you darker color. It's kind of a totally the opposite of what you think it would be. You have to actually ferment it together to get the darker color reaction. You can't just dump Viognier that's already made into Syrah to get that co-ferment. So when I started, before Brandon was at the winery and I basically knew nothing, and then he corrected me on everything when he started working for us. My thought was, if you look at the Rhone, Côte-Rôtie, Cornas, Hermitage, Saint-Joseph, so on and so on and so on. Someone just wrote this soy sauce pair with Luden's cough drops. I'm just getting harassed here by the 50 fraternity brothers that are on this feed. So thanks, guys. So My thought was that where they co-ferment in the Rhone, it's the coldest. It's the coldest parts of the Rhone Valley. So we would take our coldest fruit and co-ferment it with Viognier, and I was just never happy with the results. I just thought it made more fruity red wine. And kind of accidentally, because when we bought Forgotten Hills, there's some Viognier there, and we weren't really doing co-ferments, and it didn't always line up with the wine that we're making in Lake Chelan, which was single vineyard. So we had some extra Viogniers, so we kind of just threw it in some different lots, and we noticed that the plots that we have from the rocks, the co-ferment was amazing, which to me is totally opposite what you would think, because the rocks is one of the warmer sites, and that's exactly opposite what they do in the Rhone. So, we've done some co-ferments with Lake Collines. We've done some co-ferments in the rocks. Where else have we done co-ferments?
We tried a little bit with Red Willow this last year with our younger block out there. We've done a little bit at Forgotten Hills, just kind of playing around with it. We're doing this all as experimental, though. It's just a ton and a half here and a ton and a half there, just to see what works best. But definitely, I agree with you. The rocks is by far the best. I think that has to do with those wines are just so savory already that adding this kind of floral and fruity component to them actually makes the rocks wines more palatable with the Viognier there, as well as when you have rocks wines tend to have a higher pH. When you have a higher pH, you tend to have less color. So I think that also has to do with the benefits of Viognier in the rocks there.
Yeah. So pH and acid. So when we're tasting wine, we have two different kinds of acid. So when we say a wine is acidic, we think lemon juice. So if you drink lemon juice, that's what acidic wine is. pH is basically how the wine feels on your mouth. So high pH is just drink red wine like Syrah or Shiraz from Australia. You'll understand that it kind of just like sits on the middle of your tongue, which is totally fine. A low pH wine would be something like Chianti, where the wine is almost mouth puckering in the center of your tongue. So they're kind of different flavors that you will have. Here's actually a really interesting question from Dan F, because this scared the heck out of us as well. The wildfires. So he's asking what are the challenges, surprises of the no, that wasn't the one. There was a wildfire question somewhere. We'll take it. But when the wildfires were going on in 2017, Brandon and I were a little nervous because obviously it was extremely hazy out. But we noticed real quickly that in all the ferments we had going on, there was basically no impact of the smoke whatsoever. And I haven't done a scientific study on this, but I know from the larger companies that did massive amounts of testing where they tested every single lot that they had fermenting, which is a monumental expense because it's a very expensive test to test for smoke taint. Most wineries found little to no smoke taint just coming from the air. Where they found smoke taint was if you had a fire that was basically very, very close to your vineyard. And what I've seen in Sonoma and in Napa, I kind of agree that to get the smoke taint in the wine, you actually have to have the fire really close to the vineyard. I mean, within 100 yards, within a football field. Yeah. And just so you know, if you've never tasted smoke taint wine, it's not barbecue. It's not Texas barbecue. It's like dirty ashtray smelling. You can't drink it. You would never want to drink it.
Yeah, it also matters what stage you are in the development of the berry. If, for example, if you have fires, in the last week of July, first week of August, right when you're going through veraison, that's when the grapes are actually the most susceptible. When that skin is changing from hard and green to actually colored up and soft. It really depends on what stage those forest fires are happening. Like if you have forest fires in June, you're probably not going to pick up anything in those grapes.
Yeah, exactly. Let's drink some Forgotten Hills.
Perfect. Oof.
Yeah, exactly.
It's always my favorite.
Yeah, so this is a vineyard that's really close to Pam and I's heart. When we went to Walla Walla, we initially tasted wine at Lake Collines with Norma Kibben, and then a friend of mine, Jamie Brown from Waters Winery, he had been working with Forgotten Hills for a number of years at a previous project that he was doing, and I was just blown away by it by day one. And it's a when you go to Forgotten, explain how Forgotten Hills looks, Brandon.
Well, so you go into a little subdevelopment, and so it's house, 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 and then in the very corner where you would think there would be another house, there's just a big 10-acre vineyard. It's like suburbia and then a vineyard. So it's honestly it's quite funny.
Yeah, so when people come to the winery and they want to do the vineyard tour, we kind of just do that on the drive by. We're like, yeah, here's the beautiful mountain vineyard, and there's Forgotten Hills. Let's go over to the estate vineyard at JB George. But it's a really interesting vineyard because that part of the valley, what basically happens is all the cold air just kind of sweeps out of the mountains and sits right over that area, and the soils there are very, very shallow. It's basically just basalt, so fractured rock, and it's just a really special place. But we might harvest Lake Collines, which is just basically directly a mile to the east, and you can see it from Lake Collines. We might harvest it 3 weeks later, and it's actually a lower altitude, and in theory it should be a warmer site. But it's a very, very cold site. But that being said, it's an interesting site in the fact that, and this has really been Brandon has been driving me on this, and when winemakers find a really cold site, and everyone or a lot of winemakers, we want to make wines that are really elegant and really low alcohol. You go, wow, that's a really cold site. And so I think I can pick that at 12.5% alcohol, and it's going to make amazing wine. And I think Brandon has really pointed out that that vineyard really, for whatever reason, just needs a little more ripening. And
needs to be like 13.5 is really where it settles in good. And that usually puts you into October for picking times in this vineyard. Whereas we're picking the rest of we pretty much picked every Syrah lot we have by September 10th, September 15th. What do you say? And then Forgotten Hills is always the outlier, and it's like October 10th, October 15th. It's always right in line with when we start picking Cabernet.
Yeah, exactly. So someone asked, what was Forgotten Hills in before we started putting it in? It was in CV, but we used to share the vineyard before 2010 or 2012. When did we fully take it over?
We took it over for ours only in 2013.
Yeah.
And we also have had it in the earlier versions of the Lagniappe. In the earlier days, Forgotten Hills was making it into the Lagniappe too.
Yeah, it's it's an amazing vineyard. And what we did is we switched all our vineyards to organic, and it's been interesting to see how the vineyard kind of struggles a little bit when you switch from even sustainable farming to organic farming. And I think that really starting in 15 and 16 was when it really came back and said, okay, it's just going to be balanced, and the vineyard itself is going to have to figure it out regardless of what Mother Nature hands to it. And I think that's been a really amazing transition to watch as time has gone on.
Yeah. You can see it in the soils out at Forgotten Hills, how much the soils have changed. I remember when we first got into the vineyard, you would grab a handful of the soil and it'd just be this dry, dusty, nothing really living inside of it. Now when you grab the soil, it's very rich. You'll find earthworms in there. It's definitely a living soil now, which is, I think, kind of everyone's overall goal with going organic or going sustainable is to create a living soil. And I think that's what we've kind of done over time out at Forgotten Hills.
Yeah, exactly. Anything else about Forgotten Hills? I don't know. Let's taste some Gramercy Estate.
Yes, let's move on.
I'm just looking at the questions quickly to see if there's anything. Yeah, and you know, Forgotten Hills was an interesting wine for me because when I was a somm, when I was living in Las Vegas, Glen Fiona was making wine from the vineyard, although they did not call it Forgotten Hills, but it was like year 2 or year 3 of the vineyard. The vineyard was owned by this guy named Jeff Hill. He basically planted the vineyard in his backyard and the property behind him, and said that when my kids went to college, they forgot about me. So this was my project when I was retiring. And Glen Fiona was kind of this couple of years, this cult Syrah wine. People in Vegas were like, "Wow, what is this?" And I remember I bought a bunch of it in '97 and '98. So it's basically my first introduction to Washington Syrah was Forgotten Hills. So next, Gramercy Estate. So I guess we're not officially calling this a wine club wine anymore, are we? We're just kind of in the lineup when it's
in the lineup.
Yeah.
Yeah, this was the plan though. When the vineyards got to be of the age where we thought they could show on their own, that's what we wanted to do. So that's kind of what we're showcasing.
Yeah, Brandon and I's and Pam's kind of thinking with our estate wine was, we wanted to make, when we put estate wines out, we wanted them to be of just absolutely amazing quality. And I think it took some wine. It takes time for vineyards to grow up, and it takes time to understand what you're doing with the vineyard and what parts of the vineyard work well for particular programs and particularly I think at we have a vineyard. Technically, we didn't name it this. It's just on JB George Road, so we never got around to naming it. So we just call it JB George. I don't know.
Original,
yeah. It's right across the street from Pepperbridge. When we purchased the vineyard in 2006, it was farmed biodynamically, but let's just say we could actually pull vines out of the ground. So it wasn't the most taken care of vineyard. And it's taken a while to get that vineyard to where we feel it's reserve level quality. But it's right across the street from Pepperbridge, and in years that we don't have a freeze, it's just absolutely amazing quality. But I think it's a vineyard. You have to say, if you're going to make great wine, it's got to be in places where you have the potential to lose the vineyard in bad vintages. And I think that the Walla Walla Valley, the valley floor, you can really get punished in a vintage where you have a freeze.
Yep.
Yeah. But since 2014, 2015, I think that JB George Vineyard has just been fantastic quality. So we've taken it from the Lower East wines and moved it up into it's actually its own wine. But the interesting thing about this wine is the 2016 we did the other release, right?
Yeah, that was the previous one, the Merlot.
Yeah. So in 2016, it was primarily a Merlot, and in 2017 we flipped it over, and this wine is 99% Cab and only 1% Merlot.
Yeah, we're just gonna let the blending table take the lead on this wine. Whatever is the star from the vintage from those the blocks at the estate vineyards is what's going to lead the wine.
Yeah, it's funny. Someone in Silicon Valley who I have great respect for his palate tasted this wine a couple days ago and texted me. And he's like, "Wow, this is just like the old California cabs from the 70s and the 80s." And I don't believe that he and I had the conversation before that. And I was like, that is exactly what I'm looking for in Cabernet. I really like Cabernet that it's fruity, it's earthy. It maybe has a tiny, tiny, tiny bit of green, because I think that green, as the wine ages, tends to integrate. What is green in Cabernet? It's called pyrazine. It's the same thing that gives pepper its flavor. And I think that winemakers have gotten scared of that little bit of green, but I think it just adds a little bit 3 or 4 years to 20 years down the road. So here's a tough question, because I actually haven't thought about it for a while. So give Syrah 5 years, but how about Cab?
Oof.
You know, I go from. I mean, I wrote the notes for the 16 Cab recently, and that wine is tannic, and I love it. And we've had 2 or 3 bottles of just the 16 Cab, and it's super tannic right now. But I kind of like that, and I think a lot of people would say, "Oh, that wine is too hard." But I don't know. When is Cabernet ready to drink?
I mean, it really depends on how you like drinking your wine. It's just as you said. You don't mind more aggressive tannins, but there's a lot of people out there that don't want that. So to me, if you want to have a cab that has less aggressive tannins, you got to wait 8 to 10 years for that to happen. That's just how long Cabernet takes. So but the longevity of it is, I mean, I think your first cab's the 2006, like that has a ton of life left in it, and we're going on 14 years right now.
Yeah. I think that well, I think that everything should be decanted. Whether it's champagne, whether it's white wine, whether it's red wine, I think everything unless you're drinking really crazy old wine, then hopefully if it should be decanted or not. But I think everything benefits from decant, and people kind of get blown away. They're like, "Wait, you decant champagne?" I'm like, "Yeah, I think everything benefits from a 1 or 2 hour decant." I think the wine's just particularly 2 hours. Decanter 5, 10 years ago got a bunch of really high end somms together, master wine, master sommeliers, and did a whole trial on what the length of time decanting was, and almost unanimously they said 2 hours is like the best amount of time to decant a wine. And I actually kind of agree with that. But if you have wine that is going to be too young to drink, a great way to do it is 24 hours before you want to drink it. Just pull the cork, put the cork right back in, and the next day, 24 hours later, you're gonna end up with awesome wine. But I think that I don't know if I was gonna say with Cab, I would say, at least with our Cab, I would say maybe it's ready a year earlier than Syrah. I mean, we pick Cab slightly riper than we do for Syrah, so it's a little more ready. But I think I don't know, maybe that'll be the next experiment. We do a Cab vertical and kind of figure out exactly where we like Cabernet. This is a good question. Are you being allowed to tend the vineyards prune or currently unable to do so in Washington State lockdown?
We are still able to work in the vineyards. Agriculture is still an essential activity. Basically, we talked to our vineyard manager about it. What they're doing actively in the vineyard is every person just takes a row. There's not two people down any rows. The row spacing is about 8 feet. So that's basically the way they're distancing. They're just asking, all the workers to, not share meals in the vineyards, this and that. But in terms of workflow in the vineyards, they're pruning away. We just got finished pruning at JB George, so that all just happened, and we're able to continue, but being careful and social distancing.
2007 vintage. I don't know if this is Cabernet or Syrah, but I love our 2007 vintage. I don't think that you waited too long at all. I think those are just really, really great wines. So particularly, I just had the 7 Lagniappe, and I was really happy with that wine. So lastly, Sangiovese.
NGO.
So there's always the question of how did you end up with Sangiovese? And I love Sangiovese. I think it's an absolutely amazing variety. Didn't necessarily expect to make it in Washington, but I've always been enamored with Ciel de Cheval Vineyard. Before I got to Washington, I just loved Shampoo Vineyard and Ciel de Cheval Vineyard, and I thought they were absolutely amazing. And went over to talk to the partners at Shampoo to see if we can get some fruit. and they recommended that we go across the street to talk to Dick Bechtel at Finney Hill because he had a lot of grapes coming on that they thought was just going to be crazy good quality in the same vein as their old vine stuff that they had, because the soils are different between their old vine and newer vine blocks. And we've just loved what's going on with Finney Hill. But I felt like, for me, a lot of the great Washington cabs historically, you take Red Mountain and blend it with Horse Seven Hills fruit. So we were looking for a Horse Seven Hills source. So we started talking to the managers at the time of Ciel de Cheval, and they were like, we have some Sangiovese. We would love to get you Cabernet, but when Cabernet becomes available, if you're already working with the vineyard, we'll know what you want. I think we'll be able to work better together. So we agreed to take some Sangiovese, and so we did so in 2012 and 2013. And, unfortunately, wine has such a long life cycle. I wish we could go back and make a 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, because you put some age on Ciel de Cheval Sangio, and it turns into something really special.
It's delicious.
So, Brandon, when you were making this wine, did you find anything? People say that Sangiovese can be really difficult to work with, managing tannins and just can be a difficult grape to work with. Did you find there was anything especially hard working with Sangio, or?
I mean, he has a crazy amount of acid. For grapes grown on Red Mountain, you would not expect grapes grown in such a hot environment to have the crazy amount of acid that Sangiovese has. But we were at titratable acidities in the 7s, which is much higher than anything we're getting in Syrah or Cabernet. pH is in the 3.5, 3.6 range, so very, very low. Lots of acid, and pretty aggressive tannins. So, our strategy. We didn't really know much about Sangiovese when we were making it, but a lot of whole berry ferments. We didn't do any whole cluster on this, but all whole berry ferments. So we're not crushing those grapes up. One way to get more extraction is crushing up the grapes on your crusher destemmer. We like whole berry. It provides for more gentle extraction. And then we also didn't want to get aggressive with oak, so we did not put any new oak barrels on. We put a couple second fill barrels on just to add a little bit of texture to it. But we certainly wanted to manage those tannins and not have the wine be overly aggressive. We blended just a little bit of Merlot in this wine too, just to kind of soften those tannins a little bit more even.
Yeah, but it was amazing. To me, with Sangiovese, it was amazing how it stayed primarily fruity for such a long time, even in barrel. And I think it as a variety, it really kind of takes a long time to integrate, which makes sense. If you look at Brunello di Montalcino, it's got some of the longest aging laws that there are in all of Italy. Okay, so I'm gonna give a shout out to one of my fraternity brothers here. So please say publicly I was right about Beaujolais at Luger's. Yes, you should drink Beaujolais everywhere, even at a steakhouse in New York City. So there you go. I haven't talked a lot about Tuscany, but I think that there's so many good values in Tuscany right now. You want to find some amazing wine in Tuscany. So Rosso di Montalcino, basically the little brother, little sister of Brunello di Montalcino. It's a little bit of a minefield to find. Really, you kind of got to know who the better producers are, but if you find the better producers, there's just amazing value there. Also, Chianti Classico. Now, when I say Chianti Classico, there's a number of different Chianti regions. So if it doesn't say Chianti Classico on the label, it's a different wine. But Chianti Classico, pound for pound right now, is absolutely amazing, and it is almost a guarantee of really, really great quality. You look at Fontoti or Felsina; these are just amazing wines for what's going on in Tuscany. So, well, I think that is about an hour, and yeah, the wife is like, keep going.
We've been stuck in the house for a month. Keep going.
Yeah, actually, you know what? My camera battery would probably die, but whatever. If anyone has any questions, we'll be happy to answer any reasonable questions, not from my fraternity brothers that want to ask unreasonable questions. But if you have any questions, we're happy to answer any questions going forward.
This is Pam. I'm gonna get some of the good stuff.
Here's another question. I actually love this question. As a fan of Howell Mountain cabs, are there any Washington vineyards that can produce that bramble quality? You know, I gotta give a lot of props to Howell Mountain. You know, I look at Randy Dunn's wines. I look at some of the other wines that were made traditionally there. It's a really special. It's a really special area. I think that, you know, if I was going to make Cabernet anywhere in California, it's either going to be Howell Mountain or it's going to be where Montebello is in the Santa Cruz Mountains. But there's a balance of acid, tannin, and fruit intensity that is really rare and really world class. I mean, I would say that if we're going to look at a site that is like Howell Mountain, it's going to be Finney/Shampoo. But the difference is we're not going to get, there's a tannic structure that we just don't get in Washington that you get in California. I mean, like some of Randy Dunn's wines that he made in the 80s, they're still not ready to drink. You know, it's 30 years later. Wait, actually, it's 40 years later. I don't even know what day it is, let alone what decade it is. But, okay, so a couple of other questions. Seriously, why decant champagne? The reason being, you know, champagne, you have a wine that has been locked up in a bottle for at least 3 years and usually 6 years. So you have a wine that is also made in a very austere style. Has a lot of acid, doesn't have a lot of alcohol, and adding oxygen to that does nothing but improve the wine. So if you look at the great champagnes of the world, they're really closer to very, very, very good Chablis than they are to anything else. And you would think like, oh, I put the wine in a decanter and all the bubbles disappear. But that's not true. You will actually get a way better flavor and a more interesting wine if you let that wine be in a decanter for an hour or two. So you end up something that's closer to great Chablis or, you know, basically great Chardonnay. Let's see. Here's a question. Can you both share the first wine that changed your life?
Huh. I mean, for me, it might be Thierry Allemand Cornas. That probably is the wine I had that revolutionized what I thought about Syrah. It's just you know, the Cornas wines are just so wild and erythral, and the second I tried that, I was like, wow, this is Syrah. So that's it for me, Thierry Allemand Cornas.
Yeah. Do you know there's like a Netflix documentary where the entire documentary is basically like him working in the vineyard alone for an hour and a half.
Huh.
Yeah.
I need to watch that.
Yeah. You know, it's funny for me. My dad and I opened a restaurant in Vegas in 1993, and we were in a part of town that we couldn't get a liquor license, so we could only do wine. So I met a guy named Ron Mumford who was selling wine for to our account, and who's a master sommelier now, and another guy named Steve Geddes, and Ron said, hey, you should really hire this guy, Steve Geddes. He's a young somm. He really knows wine, and you should do something really crazy with the wine program. We were opening a steakhouse. And so I knew nothing about wine. I'd taken a wine class at Cornell, and all of a sudden I was working with two guys that were already advanced sommeliers and studying for the masters. So they were like, you should study. And I was like, great, let's get around, you know, sit around on Wednesday and drink wine. And I remember they gave me two wines, Farniente Cabernet, and it was like 1985 Farniente Cabernet. and I didn't grow up in a winemaking family. I grew up in, there was wine around the house, but it wasn't high end wine. We just looked at wine as kind of in a traditional sense where it was just a complement. It wasn't the center of the table. And I went, wow, that is something I've never had. I remember the other one was Courtois Charlemagne. And I think it was Jadot. It might have been Louis Latour. So white Burgundy Chardonnay. And absolutely, totally blew me away. And I was like, wow, this is really, really, really interesting. All right, so the last question. If you could own a vineyard anywhere in the world, where would that be? That's not hard for me. But actually, Brandon, where would you own a vineyard?
Oh man, that is a good. You know what? I think it would be a Mourvedre vineyard in Bandol, overlooking the ocean. That would be it right there. Overlooking well, sorry, not the ocean, the Mediterranean. Overlooking the Mediterranean, vineyard in Bandol, sandy beaches. That would be perfect.
Yeah. Hey Pam, come here. Why don't you help us finish out this this broadcast here?
Let me bring my wine.
So, if we could own a vineyard anywhere in the world, where would you pick?
Oh God, we'd be in Piedmont.
Move over there.
Oh boy. Sorry. Here we go.
You're not
it's
on
the
the
wrong
screen.
side. We would be in Piedmont, Italy, and we would be growing Nebbiolo.
Yeah.
No question.
Yeah. This is weird. Okay.
Hi all.
Yeah, or if there's any wine in the world that I love, it's Piemonte, so Monforte and Sarlunga, and I think Nebbiolo is
We'll keep going up into the mountains.
just such an amazing variety. So thank you all for being part of this. It's been really fun. I think we'll definitely do it again. And thanks for all the support of Gramercy. Thanks for Brandon for taking the time to do this. I know you have young kids at home that are probably out of control right now. So thanks for spending time with us.
It's every day. It's every day.
But mostly, thanks for all the questions. This has been really fun.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. All right, everyone. See you
Have a
later.
nice
All right.
evening.
Thank you.
Bye.
Cheers. Salud.